Hello, my name's Jeff Messier. I'm a professor in electrical and software engineering in the Schulich School of Engineering. And this is my presentation for the 2022 Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference. And in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about whether or not artificial intelligence, or AI, is the right tool for helping to prevent homelessness. And so to start off the presentation, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and this is the wording provided by the University of Calgary, and I do appreciate it. It is important to remember to say the names of all of the nations of the Treaty 7 regions, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda people, including the Chiniki Bears Paw and Wesley First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. But I also think it's important to do more than just kind of read word for word what we're provided when it comes to land acknowledgements, and to maybe share something that's a little bit more personal. I actually grew up in the Treaty 4 region of Canada in southwestern Saskatchewan, near the Cypress Hills, and grew up with kids from the Niconeat First Nation, and that's probably the region of Canada that still kind of holds a place in my heart, I think. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge all of the partners that made this work possible. So what I'm going to be presenting today is basically, it's got some specific results, but it's also just kind of some general reflections on using data science in the area of homelessness, and it was only possible due to some excellent partnerships that I've got with some really inspiring agencies. Primarily, the work I'm going to be talking about today was done in collaboration with the Calgary Drop-In Center, but I'm also lucky enough to be working with the Calgary Homeless Foundation and Trellis Youth and Family Services. I'm also very grateful for the financial support provided by the Calgary Health Foundation, Making the Shift, and NSERC. So the objectives, there's basically 4 objectives for this talk. First of all, I want to start by just kind of defining our boundaries and talking a little bit about what exactly artificial intelligence and machine learning is. I think there's a lot of buzz around these phrases, and but the exact definitions can be a little bit vague. The second objective is to tackle whether or not AI and machine learning should even be used to deliver shelter and housing programs, and if yes, how. The third objective is to talk about what machine learning techniques are most practical for the not-for-profit setting where you have mostly non-technical staff members. And finally, the last objective is to talk a little bit about what a successful application of machine learning might look like in a shelter or housing program. So I'd like to start by defining some of the terminology I'm going to be using in this presentation. And it's important to start here because there's a lot of kind of different definitions and different interpretations of terms like machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so, first of all, the most general term I'm going to be using is data analysis or data analytics. And basically, data analysis is any use of data to help in decision making, whether it's at the organizational level, the program level, or at the individual level. And in my experience, data analysis, data analytics are already very well established in the homelessness serving sector. So almost every shelter housing program agency that I've been involved in realize the value of data, are collecting data, and are already using that data in some way to, most commonly evaluate the success of different initiatives or different programs. So there's typically no need to try and sell the value of using data. Where more questions pop up is around whether or not, things like machine learning or AI are useful or appropriate. And machine learning for this presentation is defined as any computer program that can quote unquote learn from past data. And so what do I mean by learning? Learning is basically just spotting patterns in data. It's just pattern recognition. And so any machine learning refers to any computer program that can take a look at historical data and basically spot patterns in that data. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is a bit more specific of a term. So just like machine learning, AI does take a look at, it learns from looking at past data, but then it goes one step further and it uses what it's learned to make a decision. So AI is any computer program that can do tasks that normally requires human intelligence and, very importantly, the ability to make judgments or decisions. And it's this ability to make judgments or decisions that I'm going to be coming back to, because that's a very key point and something that we need to treat with care. So how do concepts like data and machine learning fit into how vulnerable people are connected with housing? Well, what I'm showing on this slide is sort of the standard system for putting housing resources in place that exists today. So at the highest level, we typically start with some kind of government policy. A policy is put in place at the national, provincial, or municipal level, like the National Housing Strategy or the Calgary Plan to End Homelessness. These are usually sort of large, high-level objectives put in place by governments, and typically some amount of funding is associated with achieving those objectives. That funding then usually flows to various public and not-for-profit agencies, places like emergency shelters, housing programs that implement programs using the funding to achieve these, long-term or high-level objectives. And then finally, it's the frontline staff at these, or working in these shelters or working within these housing programs that interact directly with vulnerable people and actually connect them to housing and support services. So this is not new if you're in the homelessness serving sector. What the big question is for this presentation anyways is, okay, we've over on the other side, we've got data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. How does this fit into the picture? And one question I often get when talking about this in the context of homelessness is regarding the frontline work, or the work by frontline staff. And in particular, people sometimes wonder, is it possible to automate some of the frontline work with vulnerable people using AI? Maybe, using AI to make some of the decisions around connecting people to services. So in my opinion, this is a terrible idea. So as far as I'm concerned, this is an emphatic no. I really do not believe that automated decision-making by a machine could ever have a role in providing frontline services. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. So for context, Andrew Ng is very much a pioneer in AI. He's a very large, prominent person. He's a Stanford computer science professor. He's done work with Google, various other companies, and he's a real leader in artificial intelligence. And there's something, this is kind of an informal thing that's been attributed to Andrew, and it's called his 1-second doctrine for artificial intelligence. And it goes something like, if a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second of thought, we can probably automate it using AI either now or in the near future. And I think that this is about right. This still holds up. So when you think about what AI is being used for today, it's things like facial recognition. Well, a human takes much less than 1 second to do facial recognition, right? When somebody walks into the room, you can instantly determine whether or not that person is somebody that you know or somebody who is new. Even things like self-driving cars. Self-driving cars driving a vehicle is made up of a whole bunch of decisions that take less than 1 second. There's a red light, we should stop. The green light, we should go. We need to make a right turn, so we turn the wheel. But even self-driving cars are obviously not yet a reality. So, and obviously anybody with experience in the homelessness serving sector knows that it takes way longer than 1 second to connect a person to the appropriate mix of housing, supports, and services. And so it's an emphatic no regarding whether or not we can somehow automate frontline decision making. But that doesn't mean that data has no role to play in the providing of frontline services. But rather than thinking about AI as a way to replace frontline decision making, we need to start thinking about how can we use data and the more general family of machine learning algorithms to support frontline decision making. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk. So the analogy that I like to use is to compare a caseworker in a shelter or a housing program with a medical doctor. And caseworkers and physicians make decisions in a very similar way. So both will take into account the past history of the person that they're working with, and they'll take a combination of that person's history as well as their assessment of the person's current condition right now. So a caseworker might just have a conversation with somebody, ask them how they're doing, what's been going on in the last couple days. A medical doctor will do the same thing, possibly also give sort of a physical exam depending on what the concern is. But physicians also have something else that caseworkers currently don't have. Physicians can make use of medical measurements. And so these are things like a blood pressure cuff, a lab test that will give a doctor basically a measure of a very particular type of risk. So if I go into to see my doctor and they take my blood pressure and my blood pressure is high, that suggests that I am at risk of, a very sort of specific range of cardiovascular problems. And the doctor can sort of take these measurements and combine that information with my past history and what's going on with me right now and how I seem on that day to make a care decision. And so when I think about how we can use data to support frontline decision making, I think about, is it possible to use machine learning to make sort of the equivalent of a blood pressure test for providing a housing intervention? Or if we can be a bit more specific, can we use machine learning to estimate whether or not a client is at risk of a particular outcome, right? So we're not trying to automate a decision. We're not trying to, connect somebody, make a hard decision to connect somebody with a support program. We're just estimating a risk factor. So it's kind of like a weather forecast. What's the probability of rain? What's the probability that somebody is at risk of perhaps a drug poisoning event, a violent interaction, and so on. And so to illustrate how this might work, an example is how we might use machine learning to estimate or to identify people in shelter who are at risk of becoming long-term shelter users. And this is work that we did in collaboration with the Calgary Drop-In Center. And between 2007 and 2020, the Drop-In Center saw an average of 268 new clients per month. And if you do sort of an analysis of how those people accessed shelter, the vast majority of them, 85%, are what are sometimes referred to as transitional users or temporary users who are in shelter only for a very short time and exit with little or no help. 12% are what are sometimes known as episodic users who interact with shelter over a long period of time, but there's big gaps in their patterns of interacting with shelter. So they're gone for a long time, they come back for a little while, and then they're gone again for another large amount of time. A minority, in the case of the drop-in center data, 3% of the clients become long-term, very regular users of shelter. These are sometimes referred to as chronic shelter users. And even though these people make up a very small minority of the total number of new people that show up in shelter, they are responsible for utilizing a very large percentage of shelter resources, and they are often the people that are facing the most challenge in terms of their health and economic realities. And so because of that, most housing first strategies prioritize these long-term or chronic clients. And so if this is a priority for us when we're assigning housing first strategies, how do we know who are the long-term or chronic users? Well, the first way to do this is to just wait a long time, right? So the long-term regular shelter users are the people who have been using shelter for a long time very regularly. And this is an okay way to identify chronic shelter users, or this was okay when Housing First was new, right? So Housing First was brand new. It's time to prioritize chronic people or people with chronic access patterns. And so you could just look at people's records and it's like, yes, here are the people who have been around for a long time. However, this is not a viable strategy going forward. So for somebody who shows up in shelter today for the very first time, we can't say, well, in order to be a priority for Housing First, you have to just, accumulate a long record of time in shelter, right? That's very contrary, even to the name of Housing First. And so that doesn't work. But a second approach that could perhaps be better is to use machine learning to find patterns in early shelter use that suggest that somebody is at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. So let's not make them wait a long time, but let's take a look at their first 30 days or 60 days in shelter and use machine learning to say, okay, is there something unique about how somebody accesses shelter very early on that suggests they might be at risk of needing more assistance to leave shelter? And if yes, let's connect that person to a housing caseworker. And so with all of this stuff that I'm talking about, the human is in the center. So this algorithm that I'm going to be presenting only estimates the risk of becoming chronic. It doesn't do anything beyond that. What happens once a person is identified as being at risk is that they're connected to a person, and then the person needs to make the decision about how best to help the client. So if machine learning is going to be a practical tool for reducing homelessness, it can't just be something that is done by researchers at the university. It has to work in the real world. And this is only possible if we meet a number of criteria. First of all, the machine learning algorithm has to be effective. This is kind of obvious, I guess, but can the algorithm actually estimate risk using real data? It also needs to be understandable. So there's a problem with machine learning and AI with some algorithms with what are known as black box algorithms. So the algorithms are so complicated that even researchers don't really know how they're coming up with their final decisions. And so this is obviously not acceptable for a frontline environment. Anything we do has to be understandable. Can a non-technical staff member not only use the tests that we propose, but understand them and validate them with their own personal experience? If we can't meet this criteria, they're not going to be adopted in practice. And finally, the machine learning algorithms need to be practical. Will the machine learning test work on the IT systems typically found in not-for-profit housing and shelter environments, or in a not-for-profit housing and shelter environment? And so again, the researchers have access to all kinds of high-end computing clusters, but that's typically not available in a shelter environment. In a shelter environment, you have things like fairly sort of simple database programs and quite often spreadsheets. And so we need to be able to work with that kind of IT environment. And, happily, there is a particular area of research in called interpretable machine learning that aims to achieve all three of these points. Interpretable machine learning is effective. It performs as well as some of these more opaque algorithms while being understandable, not only by researchers, but by non-technical people. And in many cases, they're very practical and run on relatively commonplace IT infrastructure. So an example of an interpretable machine learning algorithm is rule set searching. And this is what we used with our Calgary Drop-In Center project. And rule set techniques basically take historical client data to try to find threshold type tests for identifying an at-risk group. And so using Drop-In Center data, we found by running a rule set searching algorithm that chronic clients or people at risk of becoming chronic can be identified by the following rule. So if you take a client's first 60 days in shelter, and if they sleep 54 or more times in shelter, and if they meet with a counselor 11 times or less, then they are at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user if you then follow them in the historical data record going forward. Now, it's important to note a couple of things. First of all, this is a relatively intuitive rule, right? So basically what this rule is saying is that, someone is at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user, if they're here all the time, right? So we're here for 54 of the first 60 days. And also if they're not really engaging with supports, right? So they're not really meeting with counselors a lot. And this is not only understandable, I think, by a general audience, this was very much validated by Drop-In Center staff. So they noted that a lot of their long-term shelter users are sort of the under-the-radar type people that are around a lot. They sort of show up every single day, but they don't otherwise interact with a lot of the supports that are available at the shelter. So while this rule is intuitive, we also need to evaluate whether or not it's effective. And so there are two performance numbers on this slide. The first one is precision, the second one is recall. And to explain that a little bit more, our precision level is 71%. And that means that 71% of the clients that were identified by the test as at risk actually became chronic in the historical data record provided by the Drop-In Center. And so 29% of the clients that were flagged by the test actually didn't end up becoming long-term shelter users. The second number is recall, and our recall was 77%. And that means if we look at all of the people in the historical Drop-In Center data set that became client, we identified 77% of them. So we missed 23% of the clients that actually became chronic. Now, you might look at this and you might say, well, this is maybe a bit of a concern, right? Like, so if we're missing 23% of the people that eventually become long-term shelter users, that's a lot of people that need supports that might be missed. And it's super important to emphasize that this kind of test should never, ever be used by itself. It should only be used in the context of an emergency shelter or a housing program that is engaging with clients in a variety of ways. And so taking the Drop-In Center, for example, the Drop-In Center has a variety of programs, including a very active diversion program where they make contact with every single one of the new people that come through their shelter. And so the purpose of this test is to sort of augment and support those existing programs, not replace them. Again, machine learning and AI should never be used to replace frontline decision making. And so the way to use this tool is to basically run it on historical data, identify the people that the test thinks might become long-term shelter users, and then provide that list to the caseworkers that are already engaging with the people in shelter through a variety of ways. And so if this test, produces a list of 10 people, chances are the staff will be working with 9 of those people already. And they'll be like, oh yeah, we know all these people. We're already aware of it. So it just validates. In that sense, it's a form of validation. However, there may be occasionally a name that shows up on the list that staff haven't engaged with, especially in very sort of busy, high volume shelters. And that's where I believe tools like this have value. And so the 29% of people identified by the test that didn't end up becoming long-term shelter users, probably if the test were to refer them to talking to a shelter caseworker, that caseworker could get to know them. And if they really were sort of already on their way out of shelter on their own anyway, then that's it. It's just one conversation. And the 23% of people that are missed by the test have a variety of other mechanisms and ways to engage with supports as shelter. So this is an augmentation of frontline decision making. It's not in any way a replacement or a substitute for it. So all that said, I think that these results are pretty exciting. So we've demonstrated that this rule set searching approach that produces these fairly intuitive threshold style rules are effective. So a precision in the low 70% range, a recall in the high 70% range is pretty similar to results demonstrated using much more complicated deep learning neural network algorithms that are not only opaque and not really interpretable, they're also not practical for running on shelter IT systems. The kind of threshold test that I showed in the previous slide can be implemented using a spreadsheet, or the filtering operations on a spreadsheet, or the query operations in a fairly straightforward database program. I'm excited because the results of the rule set search are understandable. A non-technical person can understand these threshold rules and validate them with personal experience. We had staff members say, oh yeah, it makes sense that the people at risk are the ones who are spending a lot of time in shelter right off the bat and are not engaging with other supports. And it's practical. As I said, the rules can be implemented using filter operations on a spreadsheet or simple database queries. You don't need high-end computing infrastructure to implement this kind of test. And so to conclude, it's also, I think, important to spend just a few minutes on some practicalities around using machine learning in shelter. First of all, if you're thinking about adopting sort of a machine learning type approach or tests like this, the first question you need to ask yourself is all this even necessary for your housing program or shelter? In my opinion, this kind of data analysis is really only useful for very large shelters that have a very high client volume, right? So the benefit of these data tests is that you can run it over all clients coming into the shelter, and you might spot a few people who are escaping notice, who are falling through the cracks but still need help. If you're working in a small shelter where you've maybe only got 20, 30, 40 clients in the shelter that you're dealing with at any one time, you probably don't need this, right? Because your staff has a chance to really get to know the clients and nobody is sort of falling through the cracks. Is your if you are working with a high volume shelter and this kind of thing does seem like it would have value, the next question to ask is your data and is your IT infrastructure ready? As I mentioned, this approach will work with very commonly available spreadsheet and sort of basic database type programs, but your data has to all be in one spot. So your data can't exist in a spreadsheet over here and a spreadsheet over there and somebody else, another spreadsheet on somebody else's computer. It all has to be in one spot so you can test the data all at once. And it's also best if you can use data that's already being collected. So we only worked with data that was already being collected at the drop-in center as part of their normal business operations. We didn't collect additional survey data or put any additional load on staff in order to capture the data that we needed for our algorithms. And I think that that's really important because staff workload needs to be taken into account. And do you have access to computer nerds? So there still is, even though the threshold rules can be applied and understood by non-technical staff, the algorithm that comes up with the best threshold rules are still requires some data analysis expertise. And so if you, but it only needs to be relatively occasional. So you would need somebody with a data analysis expertise to run over your historical data and come up with the threshold rules. Then you could use those rules for maybe 6 months or a year, and then have that person come back and refresh the rules on the data that you've collected in the past year. And so this could be done with a university collaboration possibly, or by retaining consultants on a sort of a as needed basis. And finally, the last question is, are your staff ready to use the risk estimates? Again, it's super important that if you have a tool like this, it doesn't hijack frontline decision making. So there's sometimes a temptation. It's like, well, we've got this fancy new data tool. Let's just, really put a lot of faith into it and use it, and kind of forget about all the other ways that we've been making decisions. And that would not be the right approach. This is just one more piece of information to take into account, along with all the other things that people are already taking into account when they make frontline decision making. So you wouldn't use this as the sole basis for your decision, just like a doctor would never use only a blood pressure measurement as the sole basis for their decision. You need to take many factors into account. And this comes down to staff training. So when you introduce a tool like this, you need to train your staff so they understand how to put it into the appropriate context. So to conclude, is artificial intelligence the right tool to help reduce homelessness? Artificial intelligence is not, at least as how I've defined it in this presentation. So any kind of automated decision making, I don't believe has any place in the front lines of working with vulnerable people. But I still believe that machine learning can help support frontline decision makers, not replace them, but support them. And machine learning in particular is really, really good at estimating the risk of particular outcomes. And I think that this is a good place to start. So I presented an example of estimating the risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. You can think of a whole bunch of other things that you might want to include, or you might want to generate a risk estimate for. So you might want to generate a risk estimate for a drug poisoning event, or maybe a risk estimate for experiencing violence in shelter, or violence before being connected with a housing resource. And you could have perhaps several risk values for several different outcomes. You could also estimate probabilities for positive things. So, what's the likelihood that this person might enter, successful employment? And that can be used to help provide context and paint a picture, but again, not replace just, what a caseworker learns from just a really detailed and good one-on-one conversation with the person as well. And finally, this is not really aspirational. Techniques already exist that are a great fit for use in shelter and housing programs. So again, the whole area of interpretable AI is really geared towards meeting all of the criteria to be a useful tool in the real world in general, and I think in shelters and housing programs in particular. So thanks very much for listening to my talk, and I hope you found it interesting.